Just a couple of things. In terms of all the slides and all that kind of stuff that we've got, if you email me, I can send them to you. I don't mind about that at all. I can either Dropbox it or just email it to you. A lot of the stuff that we're looking at, there's a book that I've got at the bookstall that I did, Engaging with Atheists, and you may want to get there because no way we're going to get through everything. And then please do remember this evening, the God delusion is belief in God delusional. The number one reason for people coming to church, do you know what that is? Why they come? I'm talking about non-Christians coming for a first time. Yeah, invited by a friend. That's always... the number two reason now for us has been the internet, actually, which is fascinating. And then a myriad of other things, very, very strange things. Like an Irish guy who came once and who told me that he'd been in an Irish pub and he'd met an angel who told him to come to St. Peter's. I think he probably had too much to drink, but maybe not, you know. So, and notice the juxtaposition of saying, look how small we are and how tiny, and mocking almost a kind of human-centric view of the universe, I think rightly, by the way, and yet at the same time saying, we can change it. You know, so yes, I mean that we have within our the question mark, who's going to rescue us from ourselves? He's basically saying only us, which is the folly of humanism, and it's the folly of atheism. I was in Chelmsford, and bookstore, I think, no, was it Cambridge? I can't remember, one of them, somewhere in England. And this guy said, he said, David, I actually quite like you, but you've got a really rotten view of human nature. He said, I said, well, do you believe that human beings are basically good? He said, yes, I do. I have to believe that. And I said, well, I believe that human beings are moral because we're made in the image of God, but I believe that every single human being has evil within them. He said, can you prove that? I said, you're kidding me, of course. He says, go on. I said, well, there we are. We're in a bookstore. There's the history section. Pick me any book. Any book. You know, I grew up on a farm and people say things like, oh, they're behaving like animals. You know, and you go, animals don't behave like human beings behave. Our cruelty is beyond belief. So that point is a very obvious one. And that's, by the way, the key weakness. Back to your apathy thing. The reason people are apathetic is because they think we're in charge, we're in control. And the first time that gets really knocked, it changes everything. You know, what we need to remember is that the Nazis came to power in a country that was the most advanced, sophisticated, cultured, scientific civilization that the world has ever known. And there's no reason that wouldn't happen in something like the United Kingdom. So yeah, that's a great one. Anything else you picked up on in that you could use as a hook or a discussion?
Sadly, we're not getting any better, more dangerously, more intelligent.
Yeah, you can, because here's an argument that people will use. Science gives us toasters and iPhones and whatever, and religion gives us wars, to which you just simply respond, science also gives us the atomic bomb. And it's not science. Science isn't a thing or even a philosophy. It's what human beings do with the knowledge that we have. The very interesting point, John Haldane, who's a Roman Catholic philosopher from St. Andrews University, makes this really important point, and it's really helpful to grasp this. It really helped me. When we talk about being progressive, what is assumed by the people who say that is human beings are inherently progressing in everything. The reality is, the only area that we can identify and prove that we have advanced in is in technological knowledge. Have we progressed in literature? You know, so for example, would you say that the best books ever written were written this year or last year? You know, are they better than Shakespeare or the ancient Greeks? You know, have we improved in morals? Have we improved? But when people use progressive, that's how they use it. So that's part of the delusion there, yeah. What else?
Illogicality of thinking that we matter and that what we do matters, when it's just said that basically we're nothing in a vast universe. We are part of that block.
Yeah.
So why does it matter what we do?
Yeah.
Why is that significant?
And I think that's really important, because again, I'm coming back to this apathy question. I'm growing up with kids in the city. What we do is we try and take them out for a camp. Now, I have the advantage of living very close to the Scottish Highlands, and 30 miles north of us, there's a place called Glendall and Glenila, and it does sound idyllic, and it is. It's like paradise to me. But you go there at night, you take these kids up there, and we just say, look at the stars. And they make you feel like that. But they're also stunning. I, as a teenager, I couldn't be an atheist because of the stars. And I think we need to get people more to wonder at that, you know, and see and ask you questions. Now, you've got a problem here, because the problem is, logically, you really only have two alternatives. One is, in the words of Bertrand Russell, we are a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. There's this blackness, existential angst, we might call it. Jean-Paul Sartre said he could not live as by his philosophy, because it's so bleak and it's so dark. But that's what it is. I mean, why do you think so many people take drugs? Why do you think so many people commit suicide? I don't know here, but in Scotland, the number one reason for young men dying is suicide. And why? You know, anyway.
I think, for me, it's the realisation that today we're coming more into technology, what the world is about, what man's experience is.
Yeah.
And we're moving away from God's creation and the real beauty of everything around us.
Yeah.
That people have lost and forgotten about. I go out and I say about God's creation, oh, look at these trees, look at the flowers. And they look at me like I'm a nutter.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm so rich. You've got 3 cars, 2 houses, you've got this life that you believe is free, when I've got it all. I've got the riches from the Lord.
Yeah. Well, and you see, it's interesting because there are a number of people, here's a touching point for many people in our culture who are coming to realize that. And that's why I don't mock people, for example. He talks about environmentalism. Well, Christians are actually the ultimate environmentalists because we believe that it's not all going to collapse. We believe that God made us stewards of this earth. We believe, you know, I do think we need to think about it in that way. And also, here's another way that helps people think. You know, people do get addicted to this stuff. They really do. You know, and computer games and everything else. And the way that people are thinking, Cambridge University did a fascinating study in which they found that because the way information is generated on the internet, it's actually changing the way that our brains are shaped. And so they've got people coming to Cambridge University. This is Cambridge, as first-year undergraduates who, when they're told to read a book, are horrified. What, a whole book? Not just an article on the internet? You want me to read a whole book from beginning to end? Well, I think we're saying to people, yeah, and we want you to go out and have a look. And I would take people, like Glendall, or I would take people down Broughty Ferry Beach in Dundee or up one of my mountains and say, right, please tell me this is all accidental or, you know, oh, it's spiritual, man, it's spiritual. Everyone's into being spiritual. Yeah, but spiritual without God? Really? How does that make sense? And it doesn't. So I do think that's a really important. Another thing is back to the crisis of things and the values that people have. 2011, I was very seriously ill. I was in a coma in hospital for about 7 weeks. Wasn't expected to live. And I remember when I did live, obviously. It's not a resurrection here. That'd be quite a show, eh? I died. No, I did live. And I came... I remember the December that the hospital decided to let me home for 2 hours just to see how I could cope. And being wheeled out in a wheelchair, icy cold, and breathing fresh air after not having breathed fresh air for 11 weeks. And just the sheer exhilaration. Fresh air. Do you know this? Even today, I'll walk out most mornings and just go, fresh air. You know? And when something like that happens to you, things like fresh air, real food, you know, the things that God has given us. I'm sorry, but Apple haven't got anywhere near. It's pale. The C.S. Lewis uses a great illustration. I would say this to people with their BMWs and their big flat screen TVs and everything else. I would say to them, I'd use this illustration because I think it's great. He says, it's as though you're a kid in a council housing scheme and in your backyard there's just mud. but you're playing there in the mud and it's all you know and you're happy. And then someone takes you off to the beach. Glorious beach with white sand and everything. Are you wanting to go back to the mud pit? No chance. And I think we've got to say to people, they're saying to us, oh, you're religious people because you can't cope and you're living in this delusional world. I think we've got to say to them, actually, you're living in the shadowlands. We're living in the reality. And there's a greater reality yet to come. That messes with their head as well. Anything else on that clip that you picked up? One of the obvious ones right at the beginning, the thousands of religions. So all this killing and everything else, it's all religions. How can these religions all be right? We'll come back to that one, though, because I want to say something about that. And the other one is about the implication that if you believe in God, you believe that the earth is the center of the universe. Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, has this amazing statement. He says the universe looks as though it were created by a God who intended to make beings just like us. But because he won't accept that, he ends up writing a book that's so difficult to read, it's the most unread boat book in history. People buy it, put it on their coffee table to impress people. I always say to our guys, no, don't. It's not going to work with the girls. Buy Pride and Prejudice, leave it on the table, you're in. That's how it works. But that Stephen Hawking book, that's why his book is so difficult. Because he's looking at the obvious and he's saying, no, that can't be. So I think that's an important thing, the religions, the cruelty, the environment. But for me, the last one is this. We must ask questions of those in authority. Here's the thing. Christians are now the rebels and the radicals and so on. We're asking questions of those in authority. So people say, oh, well, everyone supports same-sex marriage, for example. Really? Why? What's the reason? What's the purpose? Oh, it's all about love. Really? Okay. What's love? And for me, I just keep plugging away with questions because our society is a dumbed-down society where people are just chirking out cliches all the time. And I think when Christians are thinking, and questions, by the way, don't have to be aggressive. They can be gently probing. That really can help. Anyway, we'll go on with this, and we'll see what we can do. This is very important from Chesterton. And by the way, Chesterton's great. If you're talking to Roman Catholic people, there's two things I would always do. One, Pope Benedict has several books on Jesus, a trilogy, Jesus of Nazareth. The first in particular is brilliant. Now, you can punch out the Mariology and stuff like that, but most of it is one of the best books on Jesus I've ever read. So if I meet a Catholic, I always say, well, you'd be interested in reading something. Oh, no. I said, well, I've got a book by the Pope here. Yeah, right. They're not going to turn down a book by the Pope, are they? So I get them to read that. The other is Chesterton. Man is not really convinced of a philosophic theory when he finds that something proves it. He's only really convinced when he finds that everything proves it. Actually, that's the position where I'm at with Christianity. To me, things don't make sense outside of Jesus Christ. Right, evidence and faith. Let's deal with this one because it's the... Let me give you, just hang on, the kind of argument, and then I want to see if you can help me with it. I just need to find where I'm at. When someone asks you to prove Christianity, what can you say? What's the answer to be? You say, I believe it. It sounds quite humble. They'll say, yeah, I believe in God if you showed me. Where's your evidence? What are you going to say? You can point to Jesus, the historical Jesus, yeah.
Yeah, eyewitness testimonies.
Eyewitness testimonies of the Gospels.
What do you mean by proof? What is proof?
Okay, that's the key. Give that man a gold star. You go to the top of the Sunday school class, right to the chart. No. That is the key. Because you've got to ask questions all the time. Evidence of faith. And I just simply say, what do you mean by evidence? Because remember what they said before, we are atheists because of evidence. You're Christians because of blind faith. We say, well, prove. For example, proof. What do you mean by proof? Now, this is where you sort of mess. Can you prove anything? If someone doesn't want to. Have you ever argued with a conspiracy theorist? You know, someone who believes that 9/11 was really the American government and the Jews who did it. You try to argue with somebody like that, it's impossible because everything you say is part of the conspiracy. So there's no way that you can get around that. So proving things is actually very, very difficult. For example, I'll give you some things that are quite difficult to prove, and yet you work on them. Can you prove that there are other conscious minds except yours? That's a very difficult thing to prove. Here's another one. I do this with teenagers a lot. I say to them, can you prove that you did not come into existence yesterday with the whole world? And they go, oh, yeah, of course I can. So, I've got my memories. I know, they all came yesterday as well. Well, what about my birth certificate? That came yesterday too. Well, what about history? Oh, that all came yesterday too. It's just all been, can you prove that the whole world didn't come into existence yesterday? Or if you've ever seen the film The Matrix, this is the other one that really messes with people's heads, is you say to them, how can you prove that what you're experiencing right now is real? That you are really here and that you're not wired up to a computer you're in a tub of chemicals, naked, lying there, wired up to a computer that's projecting into your mind this image of this mad Scotsman telling you that you're wired to a computer. How do you know that that's not real? Now, my wife works as a senior mental health officer with people who genuinely do believe there are Russians under the bed or that aliens are talking to them or whatever. You can't just go, don't be silly. And in a culture where people say that sense and experience is everything, but what if what you're sensing and experiencing is that? When I was seriously ill, I was given a lot of drugs, which made me very psychotic, and I believed that I wasn't in ICU. I believed that I was on a ship. I believed that people were trying to kill me. I believed that I was the king of Norway. I believed Gaddafi was after me. I mean, nothing minor with my stuff. I was always it was always that kind of stuff. How do you prove that none of that is actually happening? So when someone comes and says, I want you to prove to me God, what they're doing is, they're like somebody who's setting up a goal in football that's that size, and then they're giving you a ball that's that size, and they say, go and kick the ball in the goal. You can't. So you turn the question, because what you said was spot on. You say, well, wait a minute. What do you mean by proof? What are you looking for? And one of the questions I always ask people is this: what evidence would convince you to believe in God? And if they start saying things like, well, if £1 million turned up in my bank, or if my granny was healed of cancer, I say, no, I don't think so. I actually don't think that would convince you. What would convince you to believe in God? And let them answer that. Because you're going to tell them what convinced you. And for most Christians, it is actually many things. It's your experience, it's reading the Bible, it's Jesus, it's that extraordinary coincidence when you went into a church meeting and you prayed, Lord, give me the answer to this question. The first thing the minister did was stand up and give you the answer. And you go, what? Okay, let's try that one again. You are able to give lots of different bits of evidence. The other thing I use is this. I simply say to people, I marry a lot of people as a minister with a lot of young people in the congregation. And if a young guy comes to me and says, oh, David, I want to marry this girl, I'm in love with her and all this kind of stuff, and I think we're meant to, but I'm just not sure. I need to be 100% sure. And I look at him and say, go away, come back when you grow up, because you'll never be 100% sure, and if you are 100% sure, there's something wrong with you. Because I said, I need to know it's going to last forever. I said, no, you don't. What you need to do is you need to sit down and think about it and think, not just what you feel about her, but can you spend the rest of your life with this woman? Does she feel the same about you? There's a whole range of different things. And at some point, you're then saying, right, I'm going for it. And you're going to stand before me, and you're going to promise that no matter what happens, you're going to stick with her. And unless you can make that promise, don't do it. But don't make that promise based on, I got to feel like this all the time. And I need, nobody does that. And it's funny when this proof and evidence stuff how people always say to me, give us evidence, and I'll tell you what happens is I give them evidence and they go immediately something else, and they go into something else and something else. Bottom line is they don't want to believe. But it's still good to do as much as you can. And the other thing that I would say with that is you've got to keep hammering away with your faith is based upon evidence. You know, it's what you know, not what you don't know. Engage with the gospel, the Bible. Genesis reports, says Michael Onfray, that God began from nothing. Christians insist the world is 4,000 years old, no more, no less. Now, I'm sorry, but this man is one of the most intelligent people in the world. How can you write something as stupid as that? And if that's what happens, and if you read Richard Dawkins, by the way, it's the same thing. Richard Dawkins says in The God Delusion, the key question, now I thought what he was going to do, and if I was him, this is what I would have done. I would have brought up a whole lot of little bits of evidence that point against God. But he goes for one huge, big leap. And do you know what his big argument against God is? Who created God? Now, what's your response to that? How would you respond to that? Someone says to you, oh, well, who created God then? Uncreated, yeah. The question is a nonsensical question. The question is a question that a wee 5-year-old says to me, who created God? And I go, sweetheart, listen to me. Nobody made God. God's always been there. Oh, okay. A 14-year-old Ned says, oh, who created God then? Thinking it's a really brilliant question. And you go, okay, so you think that everything that's created has to have been created? Yep, that's correct. Good. So you think there's nothing that wasn't created? Yep. So where's everything come from? Big Bang. Where'd that come from? What banged? Always the good question. What banged? Who did the banging? You know, I hear a big bang in my kitchen. I'm not thinking, wow, isn't that incredible? I want to know who did the banging, what banged? And you just keep going. Because of course I believe in the Big Bang, because when you think, it says God spoke and everything came into being, what you think was with a whisper? No, of course not. But where did it come from? You keep going, and you either end up with the ludicrous position of Stephen Hawking saying, it all came from nothing. And there's a physicist, Lawrence Krauss, who goes, yes, it all came from nothing, because the laws of gravity demand that it all comes from nothing. And you go, okay, but if there's laws of gravity before it all came from nothing, then how is there gravity when there's nothing? How do you have gravity? Well, it's not really nothing. Okay, then again, the redefining language so that nothing doesn't mean nothing. So when we engage with the gospel and with the Bible, the reason I put those quotes up there is because you get people who are who don't understand what the Bible says. Then another thing to do is, with the Bible overall, is to say to people, look, you really need to, whether you believe the Bible or not, it does make sense to kind of read it. You know, and I would make a big push on that with people. If anyone claims to be intelligent, oh, I don't want to read the Bible because it's rubbish. No, sorry, you've got to think about it. Abraham Lincoln, the Bible is the best gift God has ever given to men. All the good from the Savior of the world is communicated through this book. There's a wonderful book I'd highly recommend by a man called Vishnu Mangalwadi, and it's called The Book That Made Your World. Everything that this society values comes out of Christianity. The trouble we've got today is that people want the fruits without the roots. And it's not going to happen. See, equality and diversity and tolerance and all these things, where do you think they come from? There's a wonderful scholar in Cambridge who's demonstrated, I think, totally conclusively, that before Christianity, European society did not believe in equality. Equality is not a natural thing. And by the way, equality is anti-scientific. Because one thing that science teaches you is that all people are not equal. You know that. There are some people who run faster than others, some people who are cleverer than others, some people who are more powerful than others. It's Christianity. And by the way, Hitler said this. He actually said to his secretary, of all religions, Christianity is the worst because it takes the weak and allows them to live. Now, we're moving towards a society where, we may reject in India infanticide, where a second girl in a family will be allowed to die, just starve to death, not given milk or anything like that, not taken to a doctor, because the family can't afford. And we would condemn that and object to that, except we live in a society where people who think they can't afford a second or third child because they're able to get a scan, they kill that child in the womb. Now, how is that any better? It's not any better. And we're moving in society where when the euthanasia bill goes through, the pressure that will be put on older people who have felt that they're useless, not to waste their children's inheritance, not to take up precious NHS bed space, that is going to happen. We've got a situation in Belgium right now where a 24-year-old woman who's got suicidal thoughts has been deemed to be fit for euthanasia just because she has suicidal thoughts. I'm going to kill half the people in my congregation then. You know, I'd be long dead if that was the case. And it's the Bible that actually is the basis of our society. And we need to, people have forgotten all of that. They assume equality, diversity, tolerance, anti-racism, and so on is fundamentally Christian. Now, of course, you're going to get an objection to the Bible because people are going to say, oh, it's full of the anger of God. Well, I love this from Miroslav Volf. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. I think the nature and the character of God is revealed in the Bible. One of the problems that we deal with is we end up arguing about or against the caricature that people have of God. I have many doubts and fears about many things, but just think of it this way. You have got to create a framework, because you have it, in which you work, in which your mind works, and these are absolutes for me. God is just. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? God is just. God is love. Those are absolutes. When I read something in the Bible and go, oh, wait a minute, how is that just? I have to think about that within the framework, not the framework that the world says, which says, I am the person who determines what is just. I've got enough knowledge and ability. No. I got to go and say, well, God knows. And right now I'm looking at this and I'm going, that doesn't seem right, but I'm going to, that will happen. When I became a Christian, I was young, I was about 17, and somebody gave me a book, which I'm assuming is not on the bookstall here, called 101 Problems in the Bible Answered from the Bible. Well, when I became a young Christian, I had no problems with the Bible. And after I read that book, I had 101 problems because the answers were all rubbish. And I just thought, oh my goodness. And I panicked. And then I sat down and I thought, wait a minute, you're a young baby Christian. Why do you think you should know it all? Why should God be limited to your capacity? You need to back off. You need to trust Jesus. And I would say that 35 years later, I'm down to about 5 or 6 of those problems. And I absolutely, totally trust God. And here's my thing that's really important. I actually find it difficult to conceive of and understand God in terms of theistic terms, almighty, all powerful, that people always argue, and the character and so on. And I'm not ashamed to say that, because why did God send Jesus? Hebrews 1. He is the exact representation of his being. There is nothing in Christ that is not God. And that, when I just look at Jesus, and I go, that's what God is like. That's what God is like. Now, that's not setting up a contrast between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New, because Jesus himself didn't. That's the point. And so I think that the anger of God, I met a guy from Manchester who's a Muslim, white guy, who'd converted from a nominal Christianity to Islam. And I said to him, why? He said, because Christianity doesn't believe in justice, Islam does. Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. We do believe in a day of judgment and a day of justice. And that's a great thing, by the way, when people say, well, why does God allow this and why does God allow that? Well, in the words of Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, there'll come a day when all bad things are undone. That's the day of judgment. And men will have to give account for every word and every deed spoken. And I think we need to reinforce that in people, because we live in a society where people go, oh, I'm not responsible. I'm going to sue. I mean, how ridiculous you get films about suing God. Or Bertrand Russell going, when I stand before God, I'm going to say, why didn't you give me enough evidence? And some atheists got really offended because I wrote a response to Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not an Atheist. why I'm not a Christian, entitled why I'm not an atheist. And I said, when Bertrand Russell stands before God, he'll say nothing. He'll say nothing. He won't be able to accuse. You know, it's this arrogance that humans have. Another objection, why people believe. You only believe in Jesus because you're brought up in a Christian community. If you're brought up in Pakistan or Iran and China, you would have different beliefs. I answered this one already, but you must know that that applies across the board. We admit all of us are influenced by our environment and circumstances and culture. But we can point, by the way, I know people who brought up in Pakistan, Iran, and China who believe in Jesus. There are more Chinese Christians now than there are in the whole of Europe. You know, that argument is actually profoundly quite a racist one. And it's also quite a superior one, and it's also quite an ignorant one. Because I want to turn that round completely. I remember I was in a school, and I said to how many of them, it was 13, 14-year-olds, about 30 of them, I said, how many of you believe in God? Oh, no, we don't believe in God, that's rubbish. I said, okay. Why do you think people believe in God? Oh, they've just been brainwashed. It's just their parents and friends. I said, okay. You don't believe in God. Let me ask you a question. Do your parents believe in God? No. Do yours? No. Do yours? No. Do yours? No. Do your friends believe in God? No. No. Do your friends? No. 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 Sorry, do you know anyone who believes in God? No. No. So your whole society, culture, and world is people who don't believe in God? Yeah. Okay, now go back to your first point. Put the two together. Work it out for yourselves. We're all influenced in that way. And I don't think people realize just how deeply ingrained the kind of it's stupid to believe in God stuff, and especially biblical Christianity, is ingrained within our culture. And I think we can argue that. I'll give you an example of that. Alain de Botton, who's one of the leading atheists in Britain, he said, I was brought up by a father who made Richard Dawkins look open-minded on the matter of there perhaps being a supreme being. I simply can't imagine joining a faith that is very foreign to me in terms of my background. I would feel it to be a betrayal of my family. By accepting the father, I'd be going against my father. See, that's powerful. Because he's admitting his bias that's there. And you've got to remember that lots of people have that bias, and instead of, you're not out to destroy them. Right? You're not out to attack their background. It's the same like with Muslims. You're not out to do that. You're out to show them Jesus. And he'll do the converting. Now, I did a quote earlier. How would you answer that one? Yeah. A militant Christian shoots an abortion doctor. There's so many presuppositions in the question. I would again ask questions. Sorry, how many Christians have shot abortion doctors? How many have been shot in the past 10 years, please? How many in the United Kingdom? How many Christians are in the world? There's maybe 2 billion. So sorry, give me your information, your facts and figures, please. I'm in a church of a couple of hundred people, and we've got some nutcases in our church as well. You know, any group of people, you're going to find that there are people. So, you know, 2 billion Christians, and you're able to talk about 2 abortion doctors being shot in the past 20 years. Not exactly. It's an ad hominem argument. That's one thing. So ask them if they know what they're talking about. You know, who's done that? And I wouldn't jump to the immediate defense. Anyway, by the way, I wouldn't jump and say, oh, well, that's not us. You say, yeah. Because the other thing I would say is, by the way, Christians do wrong things too. Which further goes to prove the Bible, which tells us that Christians do wrong things too. You know, a militant Islamist detonates a bomb, and a militant atheist writes a book. I'm so tempted, of course, you can say, well, writing books can do a great deal of harm. How much harm did Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto do? How many lives were lost because people believed that? You know, what about Hitler's Mein Kampf? How many lives were lost because of that? Writing a book isn't necessarily a good thing. So you question that. What you're doing is you're deconstructing all of this. And you can then simply say, you mean there are never atheists who've killed because of their atheism? And they go, yes, absolutely. You say, uh-oh, you've got such faith. because there are plenty of atheists who've killed because of their atheism. I mean, it's a daft comment. But tolerance and intelligence, and particularly intolerance, this is what I would say. David Berlinski, great. The pagan cult was never more tolerant than in its tolerance, without any qualms of conscience, of poverty, disease, starvation, and homelessness, of gladiatorial spectacle, crucifixion, the exposure of unwanted infants, or the public slaughter of war captives, or criminals on festive occasions, of indeed almost every imaginable form of tyranny, justice, depravity, or cruelty. There are some things we do not want to tolerate. And then there's the other thing that's very, very interesting. When people remove God out of the equation and remove Christianity out of society, what becomes the law? What becomes the standard? Their opinions and their views, the ones that control. And actually, they don't allow tolerance. And if they say, well, go and prove that. I'd say it's very, very simple. Just say that you're a Lib Dem MP and you want to stand for leadership of your party, and you declare that you're opposed to same-sex marriage, or that you were opposed to same-sex marriage, but now you're not because you realize your sin. What's going to happen to you? Look at the hatred that comes. I want to argue this really strongly, that we are living in an increasingly intolerant society because we're moving away from Christianity. And people are being effectively force-fed and brainwashed to some degree, a set of cultural values that they've got no basis for, they're not thinking about. And I do think we've got to question all of that. What about the person who says that it's science? I'll give you an example. I knocked on a door. I was going around these streets. I haven't done door-to-door work for a while, by the way. But about 10 years ago, I went and knocked on this door. In fact, I always remember it was a great street, because the first door I knocked on, and a woman came to the door and said, hi, I'm from the local church, and we're asking people what they think about God and so on, and the church, and if you've ever been, and what we can do for you, and so on. And this woman went, oh, no, I'm Jehovah's Witness. Before I could say anything, before I could stop myself, I went, revenge! But she slammed the door. So I was kind of, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But it was just, I've never knocked on a Jehovah's Witness door, so I've never had a Christian knock on my door, so I just thought, well. Anyway, next door I knocked on. Man comes to the door. I said, hi, I'm from the local church. And, hang on, I'll get the wife. Which is interesting, because obviously real men don't do religion. That's for women. A very interesting perspective as well, because quite predominant in our culture. Real men get drunk and shout and yell, but they would never, ever go to church because that's not for real men. They don't eat quiche and they don't do church. And I said, no, whoa, stop. Look, you man, me man, you beard, me beard. I was trying to communicate at an incarnational level with him. And I said, well, no, we'll talk. Come on, let's just talk. And he said, I don't believe in God. I said, well, okay, fair enough. I said, why not? I believe in science. Oh, you're a scientist? No. You study science? No. You study science at school? No. You know anything about science at all? No, I just believe in it. Now, that's an extreme case of actually where a lot of people are. They know nothing about science, but they assume that science and faith are opposed. How do you deal with that one? It's a huge one, by the way. You'd just sit in stony silence.
Remove the illusionary barrier between science and faith, because it's not real.
Yeah. How would you do that, though?
By taking the point of what the science, what is science as you understand?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you've got to ask, what you're doing here is you're dealing with something that's a fundamentally held feeling that you have got to go back and deconstruct. Again, it's not something that you can just go in feet flying, listing lots of Christian scientists or that kind of stuff. You would eventually get there. The idea that science and religion are in perpetual conflict is no longer taken seriously by any major historian of science. An atheistic fact-based science is permanently at war with a faith-based religion. That actually is quite old hat, and yet it still exists. someone like Francis Collins, who was appointed by President Obama as the head of the basically science project in the United States and was the founder of, not the founder, but main discoverer of the Human Genome Project. Dawkins and co. went berserk when he was appointed because he's a God botherer, is how he put it, because he believes in God. The science and religion thing, I tend to be quite hard with people on that when they say science and religion are opposed, and say, really? Where'd you get that one from? Because that's not something I've been aware of. For me, it's quite simple, because I just simply say, come to my church, and half my congregation are scientists. Because there's an awful lot of doctors, and I want my doctors to be scientists. You know, we've got doctors, but we've got physicists, we've got chemists, and so on. Seriously? But we've had to deal with there's a project that the Templeton Foundation funded, and we got a grant to do this. We got given £10,000 to do a scientists in congregations project. Not the Christians in science, but to encourage scientists within the congregation and other people who are not in the congregations who are scientists to come together and talk about things. And it's been wonderful, actually. There's been someone converted through it as well, which has been fantastic. But it's a deeply ingrained myth that lots of people have. One thing that's very important to get is the difference between science, which Christians should support and agree with, because all that science is, go back to the Puritans. It's the two books, the Book of Nature and the Book of Revelation. And the Book of Nature, science is just studying the Book of Nature. That's what it should be. But there's a philosophy called scientism, and that's different. Scientism is the belief of naturalism. It's the belief that only things that are material can exist. And actually, the foundation of modern society here in Portsmouth is based on that. It's based on a philosophy by a guy, A.J. Ayer, called logical positivism. And logical positivism held sway in British philosophical circles and therefore in British society, and it's still the basis of most common people's thinking, that it said simply, unless you can empirically prove it, unless you can test it, unless you can sense it, use your senses, or with your mind grasp it, then it doesn't exist. You cannot prove it exists, and therefore it doesn't exist. And that's where the question, by the way, prove God to me, comes from. It's from that attitude that we have to be able to do that. Now, what is the problem with the main thesis of logical positivism? Yeah. It's a self-contradicting statement. A.J. Ayer, in a wonderful interview with the BBC in the 1970s, was asked, what was wrong? What do you think was the biggest thing that was wrong with your philosophy? And he just looked and he said, it wasn't true. And it was just such a brilliant answer. It wasn't true, because the statement itself cannot be proven. It's like someone says, I don't believe in absolutes. All you need to do is go and say, absolutely? You sure? It's a self-contradicting statement. If you say there are absolutely no absolutes, you've contradicted yourself. And to say that the only things that can be proven are things which can be demonstrated empirically is a self-contradictory statement, because you can't demonstrate that empirically. And so people, that's what I'm saying with science, people get all this kind of mixed up because they're going, well, unless you can prove it in a test tube, it doesn't exist. You say, you really want to restrict God to a test tube? That's not how it works. By the way, another interesting side of that is that as we've moved away from Christianity, the number of people studying science has fallen, which I find fascinating. Sorry, were you going to say something? No. Oh, sorry. This is like an auction. If you move your body at all, I'm going to... Right, let's... if you want a book on that, and if that's a really serious objection for them, then Lennox's God's Undertaker has science buried religion, or has science buried God, is a brilliant book. And I would use that. Do not, by the way, please do not get into what I would call the creation-evolution wars at a very young stage in any kind of discussion. You've got to go for the bigger questions first. And you may say, well, what's bigger than that? Well, of course we believe God is creator. But usually you then start talking about the mechanistics of biology. You've got to start talking about, why is there something at all? Why is the universe fine-tuned? all these kinds of things. Christians get very easily sidetracked on all of that. The other thing in terms of science is, this is from Mangawadi's book, Britain gave universities to India to set us free. The West is now giving its youth myths that can only enslave them. This is ironic because it's the West's quest for truth that birthed science. Here's the parody, the irony of what, as we reject Christianity, we will end up rejecting actually science in many, many ways. I would want to, see, a lot of what I try and do with people, you've got to reverse their preconceptions and their ideas. Of all people, Christians should be the most pro-scientific. And we are scientific in the sense that we question things all the time. You sure? Like I went along to a lecture on evolution. It was hardly unbiased because it was, the subtitle of the lecture was Why Creationists Are Stupid. And we wrote to the principal of the university involved and said, you know, I'm sorry, but it's not very scientific or academic to use such pejorative language. And it was given by a professor from London. And at the end of the lecture, very clever lecture, very good at one level, a Chinese PhD student said, excuse me, I'm sorry, he said, but this lecture was supposed to be about evolution and macroevolution. All you've spoken about the whole time is microevolution. And I was sitting there saying, well, I'm here, I'm open. I can be convinced maybe theistic evolution's the way to go. It's not going to destroy my faith if that's the, and then I just thought, people are just buying into all of this without questioning. And that Chinese student was like the boy who shouted, the emperor has no clothes. And the professor was so embarrassed and then tried to offer evidence and so on. I think we've got to be much more positive with science. Another aspect of that is, I'll leave that one, but this one here. Science and knowledge do not drive evil out of our hearts. In fact, technology can increase our capacity for evil. Identity theft and the abuse of internet banking are very current examples of sin in the human heart. See, there are things that science cannot do. I'll go back, actually, because I'm not going to show this. But William Lane Craig and Peter Atkins, Google that. It's a debate that they did. And Peter Atkins from Oxford said, are you seriously saying that there are things which science cannot show, that are beyond the reach of science? And William Lane Craig says, yes, actually I am. And he then lists 5. 1 being the principles of science itself, 2 being mathematics, 3 being the concept of beauty, and so on. Or another way of putting it, a very simple thing, science will tell you the age of the rocks, as an atheist guy put it. Science will tell you the age of the rocks. It won't tell you about the Rock of Ages. Or another one is simply, science will tell you when you put the kettle on why the water boils, how the electricity works. What it won't tell you is why you put the kettle on. To make a cup of tea for your granny. Science, you can split the atom, but science doesn't tell you whether it's right to drop an atomic bomb or use it to create energy. And I'll give you an example of that particular example. Again, a debate at the University of Cambridge, a debate that we were destined to lose. There was 2 of us involved because the motion was this house believes that there is a God, and it was, we basically had to prove that, and we knew we were going to lose it until the president of the Atheist Society made a really stupid comment. He stood up and he said, as Bertrand Russell said, Dachau is wrong is not a fact. Dachau, the concentration camp. And I said, whoa, I'm interrupting you. He said, I thought you might, David. I said, well, I am interrupting you. He said, look, I think Dachau was wrong. But Dachau is wrong is not a fact like gravity is a fact. We can't scientifically prove that Dachau or Auschwitz were wrong. And he looked at me and he said, can you? And I said, actually, yeah, I can. And he said, well, go ahead. I said, okay. It depends where you start. I was praying like mad, the Nehemiah prayer, because I hadn't thought about this, and I was praying, and this came to me, and I'm not claiming it as divine revelation, but it made sense to me at the time, and it still makes sense. I said, depends where you start. You're starting with the position that there is no God. Because there is no God, all that you're left with is, this is what empirical facts. Empirical facts, as Dawkins says, in the universe as we have it, there's no good or evil. It really isn't. So How can you say that Dachau is wrong? You can't get there. And he said, but that means that you're starting with the fact that there is a God. And I said, no, I am not. I'll tell you where I'm starting. This is where I start. And this is where nearly every single human being who's got a brain in their head will start. I have a teenage daughter. You go out and rape my teenage daughter. That's wrong. I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying, well, it might be wrong, it might not be wrong. I know that it's wrong. As I know that, I'm standing on solid ground, as I know that this is water that I'm drinking, I know that that is wrong. So your only question then is to ask me, how do I know? And so I ask myself that question, and I keep going. I keep asking, how do I know? How do I know? How do I know? How do I know? And ultimately, it comes back to God. Because again, as Dawkins says, without God or without religion, it is very hard to have absolute morals. But if you don't, by the way, have absolute morals, you cannot have subjective ones. Because the subjective are always based on the absolute. So science and so on will tell us certain things, but they cannot tell us other things. Now, there's going to be a big push to change that, because the big area amongst atheists in the next few years, in my prediction, is going to be evolutionary psychology. And they're going to try and prove that monkeys and apes and dolphins and so on are the same as us. So you're going to have this paradox where you're going to have it being argued that apes be given human rights, and then you're also going to have the paradox where you're going to argue that humans should be treated like dogs. You wouldn't let your dog suffer like that, so why not put them down? You see the insanity of where we are going to go. I love, this one, I'm sticking with the science one. The scientific picture of the world around me is very deficient. It gives me a lot of factual information and puts all our experience in a magnificently consistent order. But it is ghostly silent about all that is really near to our heart that really matters us. It cannot tell us about the words, about the sensation of red and blue, bitter and sweet, feelings of delight and sorrow. It knows nothing of good and bad, of beauty or ugly, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions on these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. Okay, that's enough on science. Remember the one we did on reason and revelation? This is, though I put Bertrand Russell, his quote, I didn't put it in, sorry, was, God hasn't given, basically that we have, atheists are people who work out things rationally, Christians are people who believe things because of revelation. What are you going to say about that? Is it true? Was it? Yeah, atheists believe things because of reason. In other words, they get facts, they sit down, they look at them. Christians believe things just because we're told to. We don't think, it's just revealed to us. Yeah, go on then. Okay, there. See, one of the tricks with all these questions is don't take the question too seriously to start with. What does the question actually mean? Because where they're coming from is very different. Because you said, is faith unreasonable? Reason or revelation? Why or? Why not both? In fact, can you name a single person who does not, in effect, use both? When you go to university to study physics, you do not start saying, well, I know nothing, and so I'm going to discover the law of gravity. You are taught things. Now, the problem is that people are thinking, if something's revealed, then it's unquestionable. But that's not how the Bible is. And is it unreasonable to believe that an almighty God could reveal himself to us? That's the first way. The first route I would go with is with this one. I would just simply say, well, let's just assume, for argument's sake, that there is an almighty God. Could he reveal himself? You're asking him to. Could he? Now, the obvious logical answer is, you're not saying did he, you're just saying could he. The logical answer is he could. So, as Christians, we're now asking, did he? How did he do that? Well, in the past, back to Hebrews 1, which is one of my favorites always. In the past, God spoke through the prophets and various signs and wonders, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. So what's God like? Jesus Christ. Now, logically, there's no problem with that. The problem comes when you're saying, well, did he? That's one thing, and that's a different question. Or when people have presuppositions that say, no, it didn't happen. So I think the trap that Christians fall into this one is when we start saying we're unreasonable. I think we have got to say to people, no, of all people, we will use our minds because they're God-given, because God is Logos, because we're made in the image of God. But the difference between us and the atheist is this. We don't think that our minds are big enough or capable of working everything out by ourselves. So God does need to reveal himself to us. So we believe in both. We believe in reason and revelation. Your trouble is, it is your faith that stops you accepting revelation, not your mind. It's not their mind, because it's a logical thing to accept an almighty God could bring revelation. Does that make sense? You know what I'm trying to say? So don't give them the question. The question is a false question. The question is like, when did you stop beating your wife? That's a really difficult question to answer. Last week? No, I've never beaten my wife. It's a trick question, and it's a false dichotomy that they put. We believe in reason and revelation. And by the way, so does everyone else and everything. Nobody does anything purely, entirely out of reason. Can you imagine somebody saying, well, I decided to marry my wife because I worked it out that in a mathematical formulation, we were obviously the most compatible, and then that woman deserves to give him a big slap. Because no, don't be ridiculous. There's much more to life than the human mind. Although we think the human mind is wonderful.
Isn't Christian reason all birth and revelation?
No. And for this aspect, because I think one of the reasons we are accountable to God on the day of judgment, whether we have heard or seen the Bible or not, is because we're made in the image of God, and part of that image is in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. So we actually have reason. Now, there are exceptions. I think there are people who are born severely mentally handicapped or whatever. But leaving aside the exceptions, I think it's very important to treat everyone as reasonable. And can I make an aside here as well on that one? I get a wee bit disturbed that middle-class evangelical churches, or churches which largely consist of middle-class evangelicals, think that in order to reach working-class people, you have to dumb down. I think that's actually quite patronizing. Because from my point of view, coming from a working-class background as well, my point of view is, if you can answer the questions of a 12-year-old kid from a working-class housing scheme, you can answer the questions from anybody. But if you can't answer those questions, you won't be able to answer anyone's questions. The toughest, I've been interviewed by journalists from the Times and the BBC and professors and so on. I've never been asked such hard questions as by these kids. Never. And I think everyone thinks. Now, they may not all be academic, and they may think in different ways, but I think we've got to treat every single human being as a thinking human being.
Yeah. In Romans 1,
Yeah.
our judgment is brought upon us.
Yeah.
It's revelatory in itself because of what God has done.
Yes, but
It's the reasonable judgment, doesn't it?
yes, but the judgment comes even though we don't know the revelation. If you see what I mean. I would argue that God has revealed himself. Romans 1 is teaching us that God has revealed himself through his creation so that what may be known about God is made plain. And that in particular, he lists the aspects of his divine power and so on. So that men are without excuse. That's absolutely true. But the reason that men are without excuse is because he's given us minds, because Romans 2 goes on to say that the law of God is written on our hearts, now accusing, now. So God has made, it's a little bit of a semantic argument because God has made us so that we are reasonable beings, so that we are morally capable and responsible. And that's the difference between us and animals. There's a wonderful story told of an elephant in Kentucky, it would have to be, wouldn't it, that trampled somebody. And so the good folk of this small town tried Mary the elephant and found her guilty of murder. and then trying to hang her, but it was kind of difficult because she was an elephant, so they had to get this huge chain from a railway yard, and eventually they became known as the town that hung Mary the elephant. Why is that ridiculous? Because Mary the elephant's not responsible. The bulldog that bites somebody is not responsible. We hold the owners to be responsible. And that's because human beings are different. We have as part of being human is we have a reason, a reasonable capacity. And we need, because our minds have been warped and twisted by sin, we need revelation to bring us. Reason will tell us who God is. Reason will not bring us Jesus Christ. We need revelation to bring us Jesus Christ.
That's what said quite Christian.
Yeah, yeah.
Reason is perfect.
Yeah. Well, our salvation certainly is as well. But we will never, I mean, some Christians do set them up as opposites. And I'm thinking, no, that's crazy. That's really crazy. Romans goes on to say, let your minds be renewed. And I would honestly make this plea that with very few exceptions. No, I'm not saying treat everyone like massive intellectual academics. And they're not. I mean, I know people who are academic, by the way, who, as my mother would say, they're no wise. And I agree with that. But Keller's book, Reasons to Believe, it's a great title. And it's a great book for 10% of the population because it's dealing with particular issues. For the others, it's not. But everyone still needs reasons to believe. So that's one of the problems, by the way, with the term apologetics, because we think it's kind of like for geeky nerds who sit at computers and, discuss philosophy. Whereas for me, it's just basic normal life. I've got to give people reasons to believe. If I was asked what my job is to get people to think. And I would argue in a dumbed-down culture, people are not thinking. I'm sorry, but when Big Brother is seen as, when you read our newspapers, are you seriously going, really? Really, that's where we're at as a culture? What's that? Exactly, and that's back to your apathy, and that's back to provoking them and challenging them. They don't want to think, but they'll say, oh, you Christians are all thick as bricks. They're not even thinking about it. We're trying to provoke them to think. The freedom or repression, let me say something about that one, because that's a big one too. This is an old one, and we think it's a new thing. This is in the Marquis de Sade's book. 15-year-old nun discovers all kinds of sexual delight, sodomy, incest, and flagellation. The link was clear. Atheism made sexual experimentation legitimate and interesting. Here is the fascinating thing. In the 1960s, the late 1960s, apart from the idea of freedom from authority, freedom from sexual repression was considered to be the aim. And all that's happening right now is a result of, particularly on the homosexuality issue, is a result of something called queer theory. Now, if you want to read about it, I wouldn't bother personally, but I've had to read about it. And queer theory exponents, that's what they call it themselves. That's not a derogatory term. Believed, and this makes sense, they believed that sex was just a human appetite, and that human beings are actually designed to, you feel hungry, what do? You go get McDonald's, you go get a steak, whatever. You got a sexual appetite, well, just go indulge it in whatever way you like. It's the Burger King view of sex, have it your way. And they believed that what we were doing was repressing. The church and others, it's repressing. Now, I came across this many, many years ago, I was trying to work all this out, and I did a debate about 20 years ago about gay adoption. This sounds so old-fashioned now. Just think how quickly we've moved on in our culture. Backwards, actually. We've moved backwards. An 84-year-old man phoned me up and said, David, I am so confused. I no longer recognize the world I live in at all. It doesn't make any sense to me. And he said, I'm just really thankful for you being involved in it. But, I understood his pain and confusion. But I remember doing this debate, and the guy I was debating with, we got on fine. And afterwards, some of Peter Tatchell's followers came up to me, and they were really angry, and they had a go at me, and they said, you're opposed to gay adoption. And I said, yeah, I'm sorry, but I think a child's best placed with a mom and a dad, and I think that, mother and father and so on. And anyway, they then started having a go at me about lots of different things. And they said, I said, by the way, you're with Mr. Tatchell. He was arguing for the age of consent to be lowered to 14 for everybody. Do you want that? And they said, oh, no. And that's not really what he thinks, they said. They said, we don't want there to be an age of consent at all. I said, what do you mean, children? 8-year-olds? Yes, they said. And then they told me this, and to this day I'm still stunned by this. They said to me, and to be fair to my opponent who was standing beside me, he disagreed with them and called them out on it, but they said, David, if we were babysitting your children, we would teach them to sexually experiment because that's natural. Now, I don't know why, in God's mercy, in the 1970s, the early 1970s, this country was heading towards pedophilia being recognized as normal. It was classed as a sexuality, and there were people, even like Harriet Harman, who belonged to a group which wanted to say, let it be. Now, for some reason, and I think it's in the mercy of God, pedophilia is the great sin at the moment. But I think that will change, by the way. And it doesn't matter because children are being groomed all the time anyway. They're highly sexualized. Something like 60% of children have seen hardcore porn on their smartphones. And I'm talking 8, 9-year-olds. And I'm not talking Playboy. I'm talking about the most, and that stuff gets into your head and messes you up really, really bad. And these are kids. Well, this idea of freeing people, it's not freeing people. It's bringing STDs. It's bringing broken relationships. The way I describe it is this. I do a kids camp for one of our housing schemes. 19 out of the 20 kids, you can't say to them, go home to your mum and dad. Because they haven't got a mum and dad at home. One boy, I said to him, go back to your dad and tell him this. He said, which one? I said, what do you mean, which one? He said, my Monday dad, my Tuesday dad, my Wednesday dad, my Thursday dad, and my Friday dad. Now, what chance does that kid have? You know, and we're living in this culture where we're saying, oh, let people, it is a middle-class, bourgeois, Bertrand Russell type. You know Bertrand Russell in Why I'm Not a Christian? Advocated that women should not be allowed to be teachers if they were virgins because they needed to be sexually experienced. Because that was where he was at. And what we're doing is we're creating a society. We talk about freedom or repression. I'm sorry. I want repression for the guy who thinks that he has a right to sleep with my daughter. No, he doesn't. He doesn't have that right. I want repression for those who think that they have a right to watch internet porn. I want repression on the 1 million people in Britain who are on the registered sex offenders list. 1 million. That's on the registered offenders list. I'm sorry, I want that. I want, for myself, I want to know and be taught, you know, I'm sorry, I don't have the right to look at a woman and go, she's beautiful, I can just go sleep with her if I want to. You know, I want to be in a world where Christian sexual ethics are there, and they're not repressive at all, they're freeing, and they're especially freeing, believe it or not, for women. Because the increasing sexualization of our society, it is appalling. You try and be a TV presenter or a politician if you're not good looking. You know, it's just, I think all of that is dreadful. So I don't accept this freedom or repression thing. Here's another example. Again, not a Christian, from The Spectator. In banishing religions from our intimate affairs over the past century, we've let science in, neutering and depersonalizing our passions by explaining them away as biological urges over which we have no real control. We have misplaced the human element of love. And then another one. Freedom or repression. Let's move it on a political level. Louis Namier, who again is not a Christian, there's a philosopher called John Gray. John Gray is atheist from London School of Economics. He's written a book called Straw Dogs, another one called Black Mass. And he's my favorite atheist philosopher because he says everything that the Bible says without God. And he quotes this man, Hitler and the Third Reich were the gruesome and incongruous consummation of an age which as none other believed in progress and felt assured it was being achieved. Here's the thing. As people move away from Christianity, they will retain the fruits for a while because the fruit stays on the tree when the root is dead. But gradually it will go rotten. And that's what will happen in our culture. And that's, by the way, a big point in terms of the gospel. Because everyone thinks we're just going to carry on the way that they were brought up in this nice society where they could go and watch Wimbledon, have strawberries and cream, go out with their friends, head off to France for the weekend, head to Tunisia for a holiday. You don't expect people to kill you. But it's going to keep going that direction unless it gets sorted. In terms of society, it's always good to quote somebody people don't expect you to quote, Obama. To say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think, you know what's happened? In our culture, people say, look at these Christians, they're trying to take over our country. And we're going, wait a minute, guys, we built the nest, you're the cuckoos. You know? You are going to turn it around and change it, and we don't know what you're going to change it into. It is going to change. This man here, Peter Hitchens, brother of Christopher, he was converted because he went to Russia as a communist, saw what happened there, went to France, saw a painting, I can't remember by who, of hell and the judgment day, and looked at the people in hell and said, that's me. And Hitchens he's not my style of politics, I have to admit, and he's not my theology either in some things. Hates Calvinists, but I'm working on him. But he's got some fantastic stuff about where Britain is headed and what's happened. And I think, here's in terms of our evangelism, I think we make a big mistake if we just do evangelism as saying it's about the personal soul getting them saved. I think we're saying, no, actually, this is about the whole of society. I shall proclaim your word to kings. Now, we're not Christian politicians. We're not seeking Christendom. But we're just simply saying, this is not just for me or Joe Bloggs down the road. This is for everybody. I want a day coming where I won't need to say to my neighbor, know the Lord, because all will know them. I want Britain. I want the whole of Britain to be converted, and I'm quite unashamed about that. Again, back to Mango Wadi, who, as I say, I just love. The CPI confirms what I saw in Holland. CPI is the index of corruption in nations. I was asked to write a piece for Gay Star News, which I did, and their editor was very brave of him because they'd attacked me for my stance on same-sex marriage and ran a great piece. And I complained to them, and I said, I want to write what the Free Church view of homosexuality is, because you've caricatured it. So they allowed us to do it. They told me it was their most popular article ever. And but I got into this debate with somebody, and he wrote to me and said, look, David, I'm gay, and I'd rather live in a country like yours. But he said, at the end of the day, it's just about tolerance, he said, and I want a country, and he listed 10 countries. So Sweden, and Norway, and Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, and Germany, and so on. And every single one of them, with arguably the exception of Singapore, I wrote back to him and said, do you know the one thing that all these countries have in common? They were all founded upon Protestantism. Is that a coincidence? That you want to live in countries that were founded in that way? Here is, I think, where we're going, entree. The Western body, including those of atheists, Muslims, deists, and agnostics raised in the geographic and ideologic Judeo-Christian zone, is Christian. 2,000 years of Christian discourse, anatomy, medicine, physiology, of course, but also philosophy, theology, and aesthetics have fashioned the body we inhabit. How we understand our bodies is deeply Christian in our culture, but that is being unraveled bit by bit. That's why when someone's born, as the big issue in this year is transgender. There'll be another big issue in 5 years' time. But imagine this, a woman phoned me up who's utterly liberal, not a Christian, and she said, David, I was really angry at what you did in one of your podcasts about transgender, but she said, I need to talk to you. And I said, yeah, go ahead. She said, my son has come home from school and been told by a teacher that he's probably unhappy because he's probably a woman in a man's body. You know why the teacher's saying that, by the way? Because the teacher's got to fill in a form saying how pro-transgender she is. It's awful. You're telling confused teenagers stuff like that. And I've got here's the argument. I feel like I'm a woman. So that's fine. Never mind what the rest of my body says. That's what I feel like. So I've got to be a woman. Well, there's other kinds of trans as well. What happens, for example, and this is a case going on just now in the US, when somebody says, I feel like I'm disabled. I'm a two-legged person who feels like I'm a one-legged person. Can you please chop my leg off? And what? Well, or the wonderful case of the woman who said, well, I feel black, so I am black. But she wasn't. But she feels it. So if you feel it, that's what it's got to be. I mean, the whole mess and confusion of all this. I think of that 84-year-old man, in 20 years' time, unless the Lord turned things round, our children and grandchildren are going to be living in a hellish society, with the confusion that's right now being 10 times worse in that. And we, strangely enough, that's how we engage with the gospel, I think. I better move on a wee bit quicker than with this. Good and evil. It's a great one to go. Marek Edelman, of course, from Auschwitz. Man is evil. By nature, man is a beast. People have to be educated from childhood, from kindergarten, that there should be no hatred. G.K. Chesterton called it the one great provable doctrine of the Christian faith, original sin. I find it remarkably easy to prove. Someone says, "What do you mean I'm a sinner?" And I just simply say, "Okay, I'll give you a week. Go 1 week, come back to me in a week, and tell me at the end of that week that you haven't thought, said, or done anything wrong." It's impossible. Do you want to do things wrong? Maybe no, but something within you is there. So I think that's... but we live in a society which people are trying to create Disney. And they say people are basically good. And the only thing that makes people bad is religion. So get rid of religion. Because people are basically good. The Christian view, by the way, is not that people are not good. The Christian view is that people are a mixture of good and bad. We're made in the image of God, but all of us are totally depraved, not in the sense of we're as bad as we could be. We ain't anywhere near that. But every part of our body, mind, every part of our faculty is affected by sin. And there isn't anyone who could stand at the gate of Auschwitz and say, "I would never, ever do this." You have to stand and say, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Who knows what we would do? Who knows? Christianity is the one great leveler in that sense. We believe in equality more than anyone else because we believe that all human beings are made in the image of God, and we believe that all human beings are corrupted and need salvation through Jesus Christ. We don't split the world into good empires and bad empires. We can't do that. I mean, you get the Sun newspaper that in one page will have "pedophile rot in hell," and the next page will have skimpy 16-year-old girls advertising phone services. And you think, what? How do you do that? You know, can you genuinely be that thick? But yes, we can. Does religion, conviction provide a powerful reason for killing? And deniably often does. It also provides the sole compelling reason for refusing to kill, or for being merciful, or for seeking peace. Only the profoundest ignorance of history could prevent one from recognizing this. For the truth is that religion and irreligion are cultural variables, but killing is a human constant. See, this is the fundamentalist atheist argument. The argument of this book is that we and all our other animals are machines created by our genes. If you're that, you are not responsible for what you do. You stand before the judge and you say, "I raped her because it's my genes. I murdered because it's my genes. I can't help it." Dawkins is terrifyingly a genetic determinist. Now, those of you who are not Calvinists may worry about Calvinism. Calvinism without God has got to be the worst philosophy in the world. And that's what Dawkins is. He's a genetic determinist. He thinks that people are determined by their genes. And ultimately, then, you have no responsibility. On the other hand, you get atheists like Sartre. "I do not feel that I'm the product of chance, a speck of dust in the universe, but someone who is expected, prefigured, prepared, in short, a being whom only a creator could put here. And this idea of a creating hand refers to God." That's stunning from an atheist. See, one of the things you need to do is you need to read through things like The Spectator and so on, or articles like people like Russell Brand, who is a headbanger in some ways, but comes up sometimes with stuff that you go, wow. And here's Sartre saying, "I can't live by my own philosophy. I don't feel that I'm the product of chance." You'll find that there are atheists who change their mind. Anthony Flew. "Today, I would say the claim concerning the resurrection is more impressive than any of the religious competition." I do think the resurrection is still a great way. And it's interesting. Go through the book of Acts. 9 times out of 10, they do not begin with, "God is the creator, you're a sinner." They begin with, "Jesus rose from the dead." That changes. That's a whole game changer. If Jesus rose from the dead, everything has changed. There's an old Puritan prayer. "By reason I see a thing is so, by faith I know it as it is. I have seen thee by reason and not been amazed. I have seen thee as thou art in thy Son, and I have been ravished to behold thee. I will go and reason and argue with people to the end of my days, but I will fall on my knees and say, Lord, let them see. Because I am asking blind men to see the Mona Lisa. And unless their eyes are open, they won't see it. But God uses reason. That is important. Problem of suffering. I'm not going to deal with that in 1 minute. In fact, I'm not going to deal with it at all because a minute's gone. All I can say about the problem of suffering is there's a massive... I did a lecture for Keswick, which I was going to do this morning, but it was an hour and a half, so we're not going to get it done. But it's a huge, huge big one. Here's the thing. There is a problem of suffering for atheists that is just as real. In fact, worse. The problem of suffering for Christians is this, that we know that there's a God who will restore all things. I find that many people who struggle with the problem of suffering from a philosophical point of view are people who've never suffered. I find it amazing. I will give you probably the most amazing example I know of the girl whose 18-month-old died, and both her parents, as I said, both the parents were anti-God, anti-church. They quite like me. After their child died, and you take it, the funeral, with a sort of 3-foot white coffin, just relatives. You're devastated yourself, and you wonder for them. You really, really feel for them. And I thought, boy, they hated God before. Now, what's it going to be like? She was in church on the Sunday morning, and as she's going out, I said to her, "Excuse me, I've got to ask you this. What are you doing here?" And she looked at me and she said, "David, if there's no God, none of this makes any sense." See, that's the point. If there's no God, none of it makes any sense. It's only God who can make sense out of all of that. And I think we've got to turn, the argument of suffering and evil is not an argument against God, it's an argument for God. Because we're saying our God has done something about it. That's what the cross is about. That is what Jesus is about. And we've got to turn that completely on its head. Not the defensive thing that people so often do. I'll give you a theodicy about why God would allow... I don't know why God allows a lot of different things, but I know what he's done about it. And I know that there'll come a time in Revelation 7 where there'll be no more tears, sorrow, pain, and suffering. Take God out of the equation, you've still got sorrow, pain, tears, and suffering, and it's all pointless. But in Christianity, none of it is pointless. Heaven and hell, the opposite of the Christian vision. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought or feeling can preserve a life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. That'll deal with your apathy. Stick that through their window. And, look, guys, it's all going to burn. It's all rubbish. It's all going to... The Telegraph yesterday, when I came down, I saw that had an article on the Big Rip. We had the Big Bang, and the universe is all going to be ripped. And we're all going to nothing, and everything. Shakespeare, Beethoven, your family. It doesn't matter. It won't live on because there'll be no memory, there'll be no computers, there'll be no nothing. And you go, yeah? Really? That's it? That's what you're saying the whole universe is? If you really believe that, at the end of the day, what's to stop you going out and just eat, drink, and be merry, or kill, or whatever you want? Because it's all meaningless anyway. Sorry, I had to give you this one as well. I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Life is full of loneliness and misery and suffering and unhappiness, and it's all over much too quickly. Woody Allen, that's just brilliant. I love these kind of films and stuff. I mean, I hate Disney films at one level because they're all, everything's wonderful. And it's not. Everything's garbage. And that helps you get over the apathy. I want to just come to this bit at the end. You can use beauty. You can use community. You can use family, equality, and social justice. These, for me, are all evangelism starters. Publicity. I just wanted to tell you about this before we finish. We try and reach people in lots of different ways. The one up on the right, that's the kid that shot the people in the black church. That's how we do a podcast. Solace is a magazine that we've just produced. If you're interested, please go online and subscribe to it. I don't have any, I've got one copy with me. It's a coffee table magazine that's European news and views from a Christian perspective, and it's designed as a kind of pre-evangelism thing. There's a list there of books and stuff if you're interested. I do want to encourage you in outreach and evangelism. Go back to the Dick Lucas thing. God doesn't ask you to convert people. He asks you to do what you can, and he'll take what you can and use it. You know, all of us, I think, who is adequate for these things, we're not. I think if you get your theology right on this, and you make your theology Christ-centered, it will really, really help you, because you'll say, I can't do this, but God can, and it's his word, and the little bit that I can do, the little bit of kindness, the one word that I can say, the connections with the church. We had a lady who was converted, and we had a guest service at church. And my idea was I'd give out 6 cards to each of my members. They'd invite 6 people. There was about 50 people in the church at that time, building, my older church, a building seating about 400 or 500. And this lady had just been converted. For the 6:30 service, I went in, and at 6 o'clock, she's sitting up in the balcony in her usual seat. And I said, what are you doing there? She said, I had to come to get a seat. I said, why? Why, Maggie? She said, for the crowd. I said, what? She says, well, there's 60 of us and 6 each. She says, this place is going to be packed. And I went, well, the Lord bless you for your faith and your enthusiasm. She didn't see why not. Do you know this? All 6 people she invited came. And most of the congregation didn't invite people. Until your people actually believe the gospel, that it will work not just in China, not just in the 17th century, and not just in their life, but for their awkward neighbors and their unbelieving family and their workmates. Until they actually believe that, your evangelism is going nowhere. And I think the biggest thing you've got to do is give people confidence that the gospel actually works. And it does. And we've got to act like that. And that's what this morning's been about. I didn't want to overwhelm you with all the bunch of stuff. And there's so many, many, many different things. But at the end of the day, it is simply this. Evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where they found bread. And it's as simple as that. And I think you just ask the Lord, pray. We say, I've got a thing that in my head I always use, that I talk about upreach, first of all. I reach up to God and say, God, have mercy on me. Help me to see. Help me to see. Help me to see what's going on. Help me to see. And you've got to work, Lord. So I do upreach. I do inreach in terms of my own heart, where I'm at myself, and inreach in terms of the church. And then I do outreach, if you like, to people who are beyond that and beyond the church. And then downreach for me is, I don't mean to be patronizing, but I think a huge part of evangelism is reaching out to those who are broken and saying, you know this? There is. And this, I'm a postmodern Presbyterian minister, so the word finally doesn't mean anything, but this really is finally. This is what that means. A lady came to see me after I'd been at the talk, and she said, look, I live in this housing estate, and says, my partner died of a brain tumor. I've got a brain tumor. I've got 3 teenage daughters. I can't go into hospital because who's going to look after them? They're going wild. I've got no money. This place is a dump. And, it went on and on like that. And I said, and she was just really upset. And I said, look, life is really ugly, isn't it? She said, yes, really ugly. I said, okay. I said, I can't tell you that Jesus is going to heal your tumor, deal with your children, provide you with money and a job and everything else. I can't offer you that. But I can tell you this, that Jesus is the person who takes ugly things and makes them beauty. He gave me beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the spirit of praise for the garment of heaviness. And she just cried and cried and cried. And she said, I just wish that that could be true. And I said, it is true. That's what you're doing. You're giving people the beauty of Christ. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your beauty, and thank you for your gospel, and thank you for the brothers and sisters here. Thank you for the great encouragement that we have, that your word will never return to you empty. Thank you that we can believe in miracles because you've worked in our lives, and how dead and hard we were. Lord, we pray for this area, for this community, for the different churches represented here. Lord, grant the unction and the empowering of your Holy Spirit so that people may come to know you. And Lord, we would see you glorified on this earth as well as in heaven. Our hearts grieve at the mockery and the blasphemy and at the ignorance of people in this land which has been so blessed by you in so many ways. And now we turn round as a people and we shake our fist at you and say we do not need you. Oh Lord, we ask that you would not grant us what we say we want, that you would not withdraw your Spirit, but instead that you would send him with a new power and unction. And we ask, oh Lord, that as we face up to all the concerns and the falsehoods in our society, that we would be able to present the truth of Jesus Christ attractively, powerfully, intelligently, and that we may see great fruit even from this day. In your name, amen. Amen. Thank you, folks. I think just go home. Go get your lunch. Watch Andy Murray win. Another famous victory.